The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education. Connect to a world of learning.
On today's Assignment Discovery, we're tracing the rise of industrial America and greed, power, and corruption in urban growth in America.
First, we'll explore America's golden age of invention in Inventions in Industry.
Then we'll follow the growth of one of the most powerful cities in the world in The Rise of New York City.
Next, we'll see how a reform movement tried to combat the problems of industrialization in Politics and Progressives.
Finally, we'll journey into the history of organized crime in The First American Gangsters.
Mobsters, movies, and money, coming up next.
As you watch the first half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
How did industrial growth change the United States?
Why did so many immigrants settle in New York City?
After the Civil War, the United States began to concentrate its efforts on strengthening its economy and industry. By the late 1800s, business was booming, and immigrants began flooding into America in search of new opportunities. What 19th century inventions changed American society?
Telegraph allowed the military to send messages, and boats could communicate while still on the water.
The steamboat, because it could go in both directions, was used for communication.
After the Industrial Revolutions, machines took over the jobs of washing and drying clothes.
The telegraph was very useful in transporting information between two people very quickly.
They didn't have phones back then, so that was the most logical thing rather than traveling all the way.
The internal combustion engine.
The railroad also, not just communication, but also people. They could cut their time in half tenfold instead of taking a carriage or whatever other means of transportation there was.
After the Civil War, the United States was fertile ground for the growth of industry. Thousands of miles of railroad track connected the sprawling nation. And as the railroad system grew, it became cheaper and more efficient to use. America was the land of invention in the late 1800s. Communicating took a giant step forward when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Life became brighter for most Americans after Thomas Edison invented the light bulb and sparked the electrical revolution by wiring a small area in downtown New York City for electric lights. When Edison's system was switched on, it dazzled the nation. The creation of the automobile also changed the way people lived, largely thanks to Henry Ford. He introduced the moving assembly line, which made cars so cheap many people could afford them. And in 1903, brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright realized the dream of flight. During this exciting time in industrial expansion, steel became the magic metal. As cities and businesses boomed, steel was needed to erect tall buildings and build bridges. Andrew Carnegie became the king of steelmaking by building up a collection of mills. By the 1890s, the Carnegie Steel Company was producing more steel than the whole of England. The oil business was also very lucrative. In 1870, entrepreneur John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil. His company's new methods of refining oil turned petroleum into lubricants for machines and kerosene for lamps. The empires of Rockefeller and Carnegie made them very rich men. However, their businesses could not have succeeded without the workers. Mechanics and machine operators were in great demand. Most of these jobs were available in the factories of big cities. As cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston grew, many laborers were trained to meet the new demand for factory workers. City populations swelled. In 1860, only 1 American in 6 lived in a city. By 1890, 1 in 3 did. The flood of immigrants entering the country made up a large part of the new workforce. People emigrated from all parts of Europe to the United States in record numbers between 1870 and 1900. During the 1880s alone, around 5 million immigrants entered the country. 60-hour work weeks were common, and workers had no benefits such as pensions or payments if they were injured or lost their jobs. In the 1890s, a wave of bitter strikes swept the country's factories. Workers at Andrew Carnegie's steel factory in Homestead, Pennsylvania, went on strike in protest of wage cuts. The government called in soldiers to break up the picketing workers. Workers boycotted George Pullman's railroad works in 1894 after he slashed their wages and raised rents in the town where they lived. Again, U.S. troops crushed the strikes and returned the railroads to working order. As cities grew, the need for new buildings offered jobs in construction. Called skyscrapers, these new structures often soared 10 to 20 stories high. They stood as symbols of power and the achievement of the American dream. Still, much of that dream was denied to the immigrants who lived in poverty and slums. Unsanitary living conditions led to outbreaks of disease, which spread quickly and killed many people. But many immigrants became citizens, giving them the right to vote. Politicians courted their vote as a means of securing a victory on election night. William Boss Tweed was one of the most notorious of these politicians. Tweed used bribery and other illegal tactics to sway immigrant votes and secure the power of Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine in New York City. Corruption became widespread, and eventually the public demanded that steps be taken to clean up city governments. Did you know? William Boss Tweed and his partners openly bought votes, encouraged judicial corruption, and controlled New York City politics. Historians estimate that between 1865 and 1871, the city may have lost as much as $200 million thanks to Tweed's corrupt political activities.
New York City was in many ways the center of America's Industrial Revolution. As the largest and most populated city in the country, it was constantly changing and growing. A number of innovations in technology and architecture in the 1800s helped to shape the city that we know today.
What's New York City best known for?
It's like a big cultural center.
A lot of the different mixed cultures. Shopping.
And eating.
A lot of the food.
They have the greatest restaurants.
Lots of little streets and just like a lot of people just walking.
And for September 11th, I would have to say the World Trade Center, but also the Empire State Building.
The Madison Square Garden.
New York City is kind of like the capital for arts.
You know, the 26-time world champion New York Yankees.
Probably business would be my guess.
It's like a diverse place, too.
20,000 years ago, Manhattan was many miles inland, on the edge of the great glacial sheets of an ice age. As the glaciers melted, they retreated along the North American coast to create a perfect natural harbor around Manhattan. This helped pave the way for New York to become one of the world's greatest trading cities. In the early 1800s, New York became America's biggest city. The 80,000 people who lived there crammed into the southern part of the island called Lower Manhattan. But if the city was going to be successful, some order was needed. So city leaders created a template for the development of Manhattan. They developed a rigid grid plan for the city's streets. The plan showed an imaginary grid of streets. It stretched over the rest of Manhattan, where, at the time, hardly anyone lived. In the end, the grid system was a success. It was the only thing that remained constant in this always changing city. In the early 1800s, the state of New York built a canal system linking the city's rivers to the Great Lakes. Then companies built railroads. Both helped make the city a center for world trade and attracted more immigrants to the city. But the grid plan had not allowed for any large public spaces. city leaders decided to make a huge park right in the center of Manhattan, Central Park. Today, the park looks as if it has been there forever. But more than 3,000 men worked more than 10 years to transform the middle of Manhattan into a calm and beautiful area. By 1870, 50,000 people were commuting to Manhattan every day from Brooklyn. City leaders realized that the companies that ran ferry boats to move these people would not be able to handle the numbers. So they launched a most ambitious engineering project, building the Brooklyn Bridge. When the bridge opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge of its day. The latticework of cables supporting the road and walkways is an amazing piece of engineering. The Brooklyn Bridge was so brilliantly engineered that it holds the weight of 144,000 vehicles that cross it every day. At the same time the bridge was being built, New York was leading the way into a new technological age. A phenomenon adopted here first would change the world: electricity. The man who sparked the electrical revolution was Thomas Edison. Edison marked an area in downtown Manhattan to become the first district wired for electricity. In just 18 months, workers built the first power station and laid nearly 80,000 feet of underground cables. At 3 p.m. on September 4, 1882, Edison flipped the master switch. The lights came on, and as darkness slowly descended, the lights got brighter. That night, the area was like a wonderland. New Yorkers saw a strong, steady light, not the flickering gas light that people were used to. Having electricity before other cities enhanced the great image of New York. This center of industry and finance was clearly a city on the go, 24 hours a day, every day. You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
How did industrial growth change the United States?
Why did so many immigrants settle in New York City?
If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
As you watch the second half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
What did progressives want to change in America?
Why did some immigrants turn to crime?
As business and industry boomed in America, corruption and inequality became more commonplace. Before long, a number of people came forward who were hoping to put an end to these problems. They were called progressives, and they were determined to change society.
What are some ways that an individual can change society?
You can donate money to a charity.
Promote equality.
Change laws. You can make laws.
Sponsor walks and things for like world peace, maybe.
Doing something out of the ordinary.
Rosa Parks, when she sat in the front of the bus.
Helping out, at a soup kitchen, or just saying hi to people on the street, your neighbors. You might not really talk to them normally, but if you can just give them a smile.
Even though it may not seem like you're doing a lot, you really are. You're helping the people. You're helping society.
In the late 1800s, the United States experienced rapid industrial growth. Many people left rural areas or their homes in Europe to find work in the new factories in America's cities. Large corporations spread across the country. New schools and universities were established to educate the growing workforce. As people became more educated, the newspaper and publishing industries boomed. But this period of growth also included corruption and inequality. Big businesses often use their growing profits and power to destroy competitors and form monopolies in the railroad, steel, coal, and oil industries. Working conditions in mines and factories were harsh and dangerous. And as people flooded into the cities in search of work, the problems of crowded housing and poor sanitation increased. corrupt city leaders called bosses often accepted bribes and gave contracts and jobs to their political allies. The reform movement of progressivism arose to combat the greed, corruption, and other problems that industrialization had created. Progressives, most of whom came from the middle class, wanted to improve the lives of the poor living in America's growing slums. They also condemned the abuses of corporate power and the corruption in city governments. Progressive writers wrote fictional stories and poetry that revealed the hardships faced by many people living in America's cities. Progressive journalists used biting articles and cartoons in newspapers and magazines to expose the corruption of city bosses and business leaders. These writers were called muckrakers because they dug into the dirty deeds of those they wished to expose. Progressives succeeded in creating a public outcry against government corruption. Teddy Roosevelt was America's first progressive president. Between 1901 and 1909, Roosevelt used his position to break up many trusts. These were huge combinations of companies that used their economic power to take advantage of their competitors and workers. Roosevelt's Square Deal was designed to give all Americans, from farmers to businessmen, an equal chance to succeed. Roosevelt created the Pure Food and Drug Act to protect consumers, and he established the National Park System to conserve the environment. Progressives also hoped to win the right for women to vote. Suffragettes, or female activists, had been fighting for the vote since the 1840s. By the early 1900s, support for women's suffrage had grown as more women took jobs and became better educated. Finally, under President Woodrow Wilson, reformers convinced Congress to pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. When enough states ratified it, the amendment passed. Now women were guaranteed the right to vote. Despite these improvements, many people felt left behind. America's minority populations and new immigrants continued to face deep prejudices, segregation, and violence. While progressive activists succeeded in reducing corruption, improved worker and food safety, and increased the rights of women, widespread racial injustice and anti-immigrant sentiment remained part of American society.
Did you know? Progressives also worked to reform voter rights so people could have more direct involvement at the state level. Among their accomplishments were the initiative, the referendum, and the recall, practices that were adopted by some states in the West.
In New York, the gangster became an icon for America's industrial age. How gangsters grew so powerful and so popular reflects the story of modern America. Yet the gangsters' roots lay not in the New World, but in the Old. How does a person or group in your school become powerful?
A person or a group in school becomes powerful when others start to respect them and fear them.
The dean of students has power in the school.
There's obviously a board of trustees, and there's the headmaster and everything.
Teachers have the power to lower or raise your grades.
We all voted for student government first, which was 8 people, and they got elected.
A group of people becomes powerful in our school through respect and respecting everyone around them.
They have pretty good charisma. They're able to speak in front of a lot of people.
If you have a lot of friends, like that helps.
You have to be able to talk, and you have to know what everyone's interested in.
You can be funny, you can be cool, or you can just be like stylish.
So I think it's just being like a well-rounded person and like, you know, setting examples for people and like being the leader.
Living in poverty and squalor, a handful of immigrants and their descendants found a way to escape the dismal conditions of overcrowded cities. Though illegal, their activities gave them power and promise of better lives. Gangsters frightened the public as well as the press, but they spawned trends in movies and fashion and seemed to prove that anyone could make it in America. During the early 1900s, tens of thousands of Italian and Jewish immigrants disembarked here on the old wooden dockside of Ellis Island. the final stop before reaching the destination of their dreams, America. The Italians were fleeing poverty. The Jews were fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. Both groups had come in search of opportunity. But the conditions they found in New York were appalling. Sweatshop jobs for very low pay, poverty, disease, and crime. The immigrants also encountered American street hoodlums. They were a far cry from the fashion-conscious mobsters of later years, but these young men were every bit as dangerous. Street gangs have always been a big part of inner-city life. These basketball players are not gang members, but in their neighborhood, gangs are never far away. And the reasons haven't changed in more than 100 years.
It was your protection, your recognition, your protection in the neighborhood. That was the thing to do in those days. Join a gang, join a street gang, you get respect, you get recognition. You know, instead of being like a nerd, shall we say, in today's times, right?
In the early 1900s, immigrants were met by a network of well-established street gangs. The gangs had odd names: the Five Pointers, the Plug Uglies, and the Dead Rabbits.
In this case, dead meant really nifty, and rabbit meant a tough guy. So Dead Rabbits was then taken up like Yankee Doodle was and became, seriously bad dudes. Probably would be a good translation now.
The early gangs were strikingly modern. Gang members wore colors. They called their headquarters cribs. They talked of ruling turf. And here is an unmistakable gang sign, made not by a gang member in Los Angeles, but by one in New York, way back in 1889. The resident gangs had ethnic origins: Irish, English, German. They had once been immigrants, but now they ruled the roost, and they were determined to control the members.
This is an identity thing, it's an ethnicity thing, it's a racial thing, it's a geographical, territorial thing, it's a male pridefulness thing.
The new arrivals dropped right into the middle of this gangland territory. Like campus freshmen, immigrants had to learn their place in their new homes, and they had to learn fast. It's a story as old as America, and it turned some people into gangsters. This was prime gang territory, a part of New York's Lower East Side now known as Little Italy. As immigrants poured into this small district, Little Italy rapidly became the most crowded place on earth.
By 1890, there were parts of the Lower East Side where there were over 500 people per square acre. By 1900, there were over 700 per square acre, which was the highest levels of density on the planet. I mean, not even Bombay was in the same league. So we are talking seriously crowded. We're talking about people spilling out as much into the streets as possible, living on the fire escapes or on the roof in the incredibly hot New York summers.
Life in the slums was hard. Such conditions seemed to nurture future gangsters. As many as 8 families occupied one tenement building, as many as 60 men, women, and children, and they lived without electricity, heat, or indoor sanitation. At the hands of the resident street gangs, immigrants quickly became victims of robbery, loan sharking, and of extortion. Of course, everyone wanted out of the tenements. Most survived with back-breaking jobs for low pay, saving nickels and dimes for the day when they'd have enough to move on. But some were impatient, and they couldn't wait.
I'm going to be somebody. I don't care how I get out of it. I'm getting out of this. What do you got? I got my body, I got my mind, I got my gun, I got my nerve, and I got my guts. Let's go. I'm going to be somebody. When I walk in, I get the best table.
And to get the best table, a young immigrant would have to confront the temptations offered by a life of crime.
I could be dressing like a king. I could be living in my own, quarters uptown. I could be living the life of Riley if I take la malavita, if I take the criminal path, as opposed to this, no doubt virtuous, but poor. It's a terribly poor life.
It's a scene that was acted out before 1,000 tenement windows. Before a new settler's eyes lay two options. Which path would he take? The Promised Land, New York City, 1903. The Lower East Side was a patchwork of warring ethnic enclaves. It was also a powder keg of poverty and crime. Resident hoodlums ruled the streets and victimized newly arriving immigrants. The choices facing immigrants were stark. Stay victimized or join in, become a gangster, and prey on your own people.
The first avenue of opportunity are your countrymen. You're living in an isolated enclave. You all speak the same language. You don't speak English. So what do? You lean on your compatriots, the ones who have made it, the ones who got here a little earlier, the ones who got a shop, the ones who become a professional.
Inevitably, some immigrant youth took the plunge into crime. Many joined existing gangs, but one renegade group of Italians set up an exclusive gang of their own. They operated in a distinctive way, and they called their group the Black Hand.
The Black Hand hits the city in 1903 with tremendous visibility when some guy is found with his head cut off and 17 stab wounds in a barrel on East 11th Street. There was a crime panic, and there was a sense that there was this wave of murders and bombings and terror activities and whatnot, and it's blown into enormous dimensions in the newspaper.
The press had a field day. Immigrants weren't supposed to behave like this. The Black Hand rapidly provoked a reign of terror. In the wake of wild press coverage, filmmakers were quick to spot the potential, making Black Hand movies that claimed to be based on real events. A silent film has survived from 1906, the dawn of movie history. It's one of the earliest gangster movies ever made, and it deals with extortion, the signature modus operandi of the Black Hand.
You'd send a letter and you say, meet me at, the 125th Street station, 2 a.m., bring pots of money, or I'll kidnap your kid, or I'll blow your head off, or I'll bomb your office. I mean, not profound. And then they put a black fingerprint, a handprint on the thing.
Members of the Black Hand send an extortion note to a shopkeeper, threatening to kidnap his little girl.
They were ruthless and vicious in their tactics. They would think of nothing of if you refused to pay them tribute. You had a store, let's say, and you refused, they would dynamite your store.
This is a real Black Hand leader, Giuseppe Morello.
He basically worked out of East Harlem together with his brother-in-law, Ignazio Lupo the Wolf Sayeta. They were very, very vicious people.
So distinctive-looking are the Black Hand members that the newspapers began calling them Mustache Petes. Their look was soon copied in the movies. When the extortionists came to collect, police detectives pounced. Contemporary moviegoers would have recognized this as a reference to the Italian squad set up by this man, Police Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino. Petrosino reasoned that only Italian-speaking officers could penetrate the Black Hand. In a police force dominated by Irish Americans, it was a radical move.
It was his brainstorm, Petrosino that is, who created this Italian squad who was able to talk the language of the Italian. There was 500,000 Italians living in the city of New York. More Italians lived in New York than were in Rome.
The Italian squad was the first attempt of a law enforcement agency to address the threat of organized crime.
But it doesn't, in fact, work terribly effectively. Petrosino actually, interestingly, is dispatched to Italy, Palermo, I think, in an attempt to ferret out transatlantic connections. But word of Petrosino's mission precedes him, and the seriously professional gangsters over there kill him.
In the movies, there's always a happy ending. Police surround the Black Hand hideout and rescue the kidnapped little girl. As a movie, The Black Hand was so successful that the story would be retold 3 times in the next 15 years. The Black Hand was the first sign of something new in gangland. As the Italian community grew more established and more prosperous, the Black Hand would become known by another name, Mafia. Unlike the Black Hand, most other gangs opened up their ranks to all ethnic groups. And the gang bosses, Paolo Vaccarelli and Monk Eastman, stalked the sidewalks like urban warlords.
Monk Eastman is an ex-boxer whose head looks like a smashed cauliflower. He's, generally considered to be a serious psychopathic thug. And yet he manages, by, force of example energy, to sort of assemble this sort of large mass of the folks around him.
It was in the big street gangs that many later celebrity gangsters served a tough apprenticeship. Ben Siegel, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky. The list goes on. They took their knocks, they learned the ropes, and they earned respect at the point of a gun.
And there'll be gun battles on 2nd Avenue where the 5 Pointers, that's Vaccarelli's gang, and the Monk Eastman crowd will shoot at each other from behind girders, the elevator running overhead, much to the dismay of passers-by or being hit by free-floating fire. But they're not really defending Jewish territory and Italian territory. I mean, it's a bit of it, but they're defending praying grounds. They're defending stomping areas. They're defending territories in which they have the exclusive rights to extort, to rob, to protect illegal businesses and the like.
But the violence didn't stop at turf wars. The gangs tried using violence as a business tool. By the early 1900s, New York street gangs were taking cash to kill.
you begin to get the first gangs who are literally contracting out as a specialty violence and the willingness to use it. You know, you want somebody's arm broken, it costs so much. You want their kneecaps terminated, here's the hit, up to the doing the big job, which was quite cheap in those days, I mean, $100.
Murder and mayhem continued to find their way from the streets into films. Movie gangsters quickly became popular with the people most likely to fall victim to real gangsters. In the red velvet darkness of Broadway's Bijou theaters, the poor flocked to the silver screen and the dreams it offered. By 1907, in New York alone, 200,000 people were attending the city's 500 movie theaters every day. It was the start of a love affair between the public and gangsters that still endures. With such intense box office interest, filmmakers began hunting for ever more exciting twists to the gangster story. But what they came up with was to change the course of movie history. It looks like just another silent picture. Figures from a bygone era, acting in a style that today we find quaintly old-fashioned. But this is the first true gangster movie. In the 1912 feature, Musketeers of Pig Alley, director D.W. Griffith filmed on location in New York's Lower East Side. Most movies at this time were shot in studios. Musketeers of Pig Alley contains all the elements of the classic gangster story, with one difference. The extras you see here are not actors. Director Griffith had paid local gang bosses to protect his equipment. As filming progressed, Griffith began using real gangsters in some of the bigger scenes, like this shootout, described in the movies as the Gangsters' Feudal War. The use of gangsters on screen caused a sensation. The early movies of Griffith and other directors had a feeling of reality that was missing from other kinds of pictures.
All of a sudden, it was like going to see a documentary. A lot of people felt that this was the closest they were going to get to meeting these real characters. And that danger, it's a lure. It's like a car wreck. You can't turn away.
But realism was only part of the gangster movie's growing appeal. Audiences began identifying with the look and style of the bad guy. The first major gangster movie hit was Outside the Law, made in 1921. Its star was the horror movie actor Lon Chaney.
He invents this look, this cornered animal, the cigarette, the cocked hat, the swagger. I mean, that's absolutely recognizable, and it's been repeated thousands of times.
It was Chaney as Black Mike Silva, notorious gangster of San Francisco's Chinatown, who set the style for a generation of gangster movie characters. Moviegoers lapped it up, but they weren't alone. Real gangsters began consciously emulating the tough guy look they saw on the silver screen.
I think the style of the gangster grew out of what they were doing, and at the beginning you might say it was an authentic style. Then I believe it began to be self-referential. They modified their image to fit the public so that they were almost looking in a mirror in the newspapers and in motion pictures and modifying their own image to be equal to what was in the movie.
Movie influence extended beyond dress code to language. In Outside the Law, Lon Chaney is about to make movie history. He utters the phrase that every gangster wishes he'd thought of. you dirty rat. But what really struck audiences at the time was the film's violent ending.
It's one of the first movies that is absolutely riveting. You can't take your eyes away from the sheer raw violence at the end of the film. For its time, it was pretty remarkable.
Hollywood censors found violent scenes disturbing. They began to restrict what could be shown on screen. And that was to have unexpected results.
You couldn't show how crime was committed. You couldn't show white slavery. You couldn't show very much of anything. Well, that fed into the creation of the myth, because you did everything then with symbolism, with the shorthand of the dressing, the look, the rackets become oblique. They're not really mentioned, so you're left with a character study. So they helped create the genre by forbidding the show of blood.
Outside the Law and similar movies helped define the gangster character. The gangster myth began casting a powerful spell on the minds of the American public. Many people admired gangsters, even though they knew it was wrong. It's something that movie audiences still do.
The American public in general, when they watch a picture, they wish that they were that guy, that everybody fears him, right? But they don't want whatever else goes with that particular character, where, you know, he's every day he's living with the dead tugging at his sleeve. You know what I mean? If you know what I mean.
Movie audiences became entranced by gangster attitude. Gangsters were the guys who lived life by their own rules. Gangsters were kings of the heap. If they wanted something, they took it. Gangsters did it their way. They got help from nobody and needed no one.
Thumbing your nose at the government, thumbing your nose at authority, and saying, I'm my own man, I'm my own authority, you can't tell me how to live, you can't tell me what's right and wrong, I'll decide. And I think that's the part of it that appeals to the American psyche.
But gangsters were also vulnerable. They had a fatal flaw. They craved respect. The downtrodden poor of the tenements understood that feeling and sympathized.
Inadequacy has a great deal with criminality. This feeling of being inadequate or uneducated or not respected or looked down. And that's why the guns become so deadly. Well, if I can't make you understand and you don't want to give me any respect, pow, maybe you respect me now, huh?
While fictional gangsters began generating box office revenue, real criminal rackets were already netting millions of dollars a year. Crime was becoming big business. Organized crime was no longer in the hands of street hoodlums. Something else far more powerful was taking control. A criminal organization was so secret that nearly half a century would pass before its name appeared in the movies: the Mafia. Here is the birthplace of the Mafia in America, the Italian quarter of New York City, Little Italy. Italian immigrants arriving here in the early 1900s faced victimization from established street gangs. The Mafia offered a way out, protection. As angry young men, they kept the native gangs at bay, and in the process became local heroes.
The Mafia started out trying to help Italian immigrants who came here and who were persecuted and by other groups who were here before they were. See, so they had to unite to sort of help themselves. And they needed to protect themselves from the society at large, which was, you know, denying them jobs and opportunities, right?
But protection came at a price. The Mafia demanded tribute from the local community. Apples for the Godfather's children, a nice salami for his table, a payment here, a favor there. the local Don, who was the leader of an organized crime family, rapidly acquired the status of a medieval baron.
People would come, supplicants would line up, and they would ask for favors. You know, my son is in trouble with the police, or I need a job, or, you know, I've been burned out. And he was the local patriarch of this community, and he would dispense favors, and he could, in fact, dispense punishments if you crossed him as well.
The Godfathers soon came face to face with local ward bosses of the Democratic Party, the Tammany Men. They earned their nickname from Tammany Hall, their headquarters in New York, which was a place of wheeling and dealing, barroom brawls, and uproar. The noise level was so great that a new word was coined to describe a deal struck here: a racket. To stay in power, Tammany ward bosses bought votes and did favors. They found people jobs and helped families in distress.
And then they're in a position to help even more, because once they have political power, they can appoint the police who can look after you, they can appoint the judges who can look after you. So the politicians are middlemen, but the lines between political democracy and criminality then get notoriously blurred.
Soon everyone was taking a piece of the action, including the local police. And where cops could be bought, gangsters could take control. As it grew in power, the Mafia clothed itself in the language of honor and respect. The Mafia was the most exclusive club in town. Only men from certain districts in the old country need apply. And most Italian-American parents urged their kids not to get involved. Those who did connect with the Mafia found themselves in a very strange world, isolated from everyday values and morality. A world with its own codes of behavior. The Mafia soon broke out of the Italian neighborhoods, and they did it by joining labor disputes. The middle 1900s was a time of vicious picket line violence across America. Union bosses and factory owners alike would hire gang muscle, either to enforce strikes or to break them. And the Mafia saw its chance.
They were tough guys in hoods and torpedoes, strike breakers, and they were also protecting strikers. So they saw the influence, and you had a new generation emerge that could see that white-collar crime was, one, more profitable, and two, less danger of being caught.
The Mafia remained a shadowy organization. Other gangsters soon learned from Mafia methods. One man in particular was to become the definitive crime boss of the gangster era. He was not eligible to join the Mafia. But he built organized crime into a multi-million-dollar business. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, and he came to symbolize all gangsters. He pursued the American dream, and he set up an organization that became the template for the mob. He was Al Capone. Capone was not an immigrant, but his family had come from Italy. And like other children from immigrant homes, Capone soon found himself running with street gangs.
All these gangs had junior divisions. Capone, at age 13, 14, he was a member of two gangs simultaneously. The 5 Point Juniors in Manhattan, and also the South Brooklyn Rippers in his own area of 4th Avenue and Garfield Place.
Yet Capone would make his name in Chicago, a city 800 miles to the west. Chicago in the early 1900s was a boomtown. A man could get rich quick here if he had energy and enthusiasm, and if he was willing to enlist violence. Capone was, and he got his big break in 1919. The nightclub owner Big Jim Colosimo needed a bodyguard, and Capone got the job. It started a partnership that would change the shape of American organized crime. By the time he was 24 years old, Al Capone was the biggest name in gangland. By then, his face had been marked in a vicious brawl, and he had acquired the nickname Scarface. Capone became the first true gangland czar. He was a larger-than-life figure who made an indelible impression on all who met him. And Hollywood came to love Capone. He had all the ingredients to make him an underworld star. Actor Rod Steiger played Capone in the first film biography about him.
Al Capone, portrayed by Rod Steiger in a performance of shocking power.
Nobody leaves Al Capone, you understand that? Well, I do! Oh, no, you don't!
He was kind of a seductive bully and a thug. He was very clever. He had very good, insightful instincts, animal instincts. And he was a hell of a good actor to inveigle people to do things. He either did it by convincing them that they would advance, or say, either you come along with me and won't advance because I'll have you killed. Now, take your choice, my friend. You know.
Capone now had a chance to control Chicago. Like other gangsters, he had endured years of squalor, years of petty crime, years of mindless muscle. But unlike other gangsters, Capone had learned that speaking and acting polite could be as effective as violence. It's what made him special.
I like to think that Capone was different because he was a sort of a multi-dimensional gangster. He was not someone who simply understood profits and mayhem. He had some depth to him. He had a public relations ability. He was able to attract even editors and reporters to his cause, as he put it, delivering whiskey to a populace that desperately wanted whiskey and entertainment. So in many ways, he was a very astute business person.
Capone's instinct for public relations was the key to his success. Capone employed anyone with talent, regardless of ethnic origin. It was a smart move. Capone did things the American way. He was a byproduct of immigration. And as an American, he was to get his biggest break courtesy of the United States government. World War I had just ended. Americans were about to dance to the new tune of jazz. An economic boom was on the way. People were determined to live well. But forces of reform were working against the partygoers. In January 1920, the National Prohibition Act became law. Production, transportation, and sale of alcohol suddenly became illegal. But consumption did not. Al Capone spotted the loophole, and within hours of the Prohibition Act becoming law, he was stealing and supplying liquor throughout Chicago. The bootlegging industry was born. Thanks to Prohibition, other gangsters got on the bandwagon too, and the future of organized crime in America was assured. The economic hardships experienced by earlier immigrants would soon become a distant memory, and American gangsters were on top of the world.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
What did progressives want to change in America?
Why did some immigrants turn to crime?
We hope you've enjoyed this Assignment Discovery Journey into America's Industrial Age. If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.